Thanks very much. My name is Joel Braunold. I run the Alliance for Middle East Peace, which is a coalition of 110 different groups working on the ground, building relationships between Jews and Arabs, Israelis and Palestinians. Firstly, a big thank you to Lucy, USIP, the Embassy of Ireland, also Senator Kane's staff, who actually did the original shidduch, the original match between myself and the Embassy of Ireland that I think kick-started this event. And it's interesting that they did that. And the reason being, the Alliance for Middle East Peace since 2009 has been fascinated by the International Fund for Ireland. We're just mystified that there was this collaborative funding that came together at scale that before a peace process and then throughout after the Good Friday Agreement created scalable funding for civil society and gave it a necessary role. You know, with all the things that Senator Mitchell said that it's not sufficient, it definitely had a place at the table. And the reason we were excited and why we wanted to do something like this where we learned the lessons is when we look at our conflict and when we look at civil society today, what we lack is possibility. So what do I mean by that? It's a misnomer that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been showered with resources. And even if we look back to the Oslo days itself, peace and reconciliation was an afterthought. In the original Oslo Accords, peace and reconciliation did not actually feature. It was until the second Oslo Accords, after 95 and Prime Minister Rabin had been killed, that it first featured. Funding did not start from the EU until 1998. And the US program at its current scale of $10 million a year didn't start till 2004, the second Intifada. So if we compare that to Northern Ireland, where funding began in 1986, and we look at our conflict, we actually had to wait for the US to kick in till after we had the second Intifada before we started looking at seriously trying to put some money into peace and reconciliation programming. Now, if we actually look at the current funding today, we see two, I would say, pretty big obstacles that prevent us moving forward. One is bureaucratic and one is legitimacy. On the bureaucracy, civil society has been segmented away from economic development and humanitarian assistance. If you look at the humanitarian assistance that keeps Gaza alive, you know, even if it's just barely, and other things, this is coordinated by the Norwegians, is very much a humanitarian assistance program. If we look at the economic development, whether it's from the Office of the Quartet Representative or other things, again, this is separate funding that is from things that are linked towards trying to do peace and reconciliation. And that creates a problem. If you completely separate it, there is no linkage between, as I think Adrian said in the first panel, the infrastructure of peace and community groups who are trying to actually show that there is a community effort behind this. And the separation and segmentation prevents complementary reinforcing dynamics. In addition, and something that I find fascinating, when I speak to various governments around the world who do want to get involved in civil society, with the exception of the US actually, they always tell me, whereas peace building is OECD compliant about how they spend their development money, they can't spend any money to benefit an Israeli because Israel is an OECD country. So even if they wanted to, they can't utilize their dollars to also do civil society work that could benefit Israelis. And therefore, the even funding structures prevent from the governments themselves from doing things that they know is necessary. When you add both of those bureaucratic challenges in, it actually leads to a legitimacy challenge. So Sarah pointed on this, and I think Rami in his introduction, you know, international financing of NGOs is a political football today in the region. In Israel, sort of the funding of the European Union, definitely Arab state funding and others, is seen as incredibly controversial, as something trying to undermine democracy. And on the flip side, by the way, US funding is not exactly the most prominently supported work for Palestinian NGOs to take, though it's not as seen as critical as the other way. So when you add in the bureaucratic problems with the legitimacy problems, what you get, as one former senior member of the State Department in Secretary Kerry's team told me, was no bandwidth and no budget. So even if Secretary Kerry's team had wanted to include civil society, there was neither the bandwidth or the budget in order to do that in an effective mechanism. We lacked what the International Fund for Ireland had, an independent group that woke up every day and thought about how do we try and bring these populations into a position where there is a political context that can make this work. So what is it that we're looking for as we try and learn the lessons of the IFI in our context. We're looking for complementary, flexible, legitimate funding. So let me break that down. Complementary. What that means is it doesn't need to just say that civil society works completely siloed from economic development. If, for example, we're trying to re-energize Gaza with the Marine One terminal, and because of the politics that has to go through Ashdod, then let's actually have a conversation in civil society, both in Gaza and in Israel, about why that's in the interest of both populations. Let's link the human capital work that exists into the wider economic space. And let's think about that complementary, so when we think about peace infrastructure, it's locked in. Flexible. It's not only about scaling NGOs. So yes, NGOs have been starved of resources, and what they've done on a local level could easily be scaled if we moved from sort of seed money to Series A. But it's also about, what about if, let's look at the communities of Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Sderot that border Gaza. So let's assume, so we're doing economic development in Gaza, but these communities are actually suffering under rocket fire. The legitimacy that would be seen in Israeli society if international financing also helped defend hospitals and schools and kindergartens that are spending vast amounts of philanthropic resources just to defend them would be massively increased. If we look at, I'm sure Josh will talk about the after-school programs in East Jerusalem, where there is no shared space to put 500 families, but we could use this as capital project money to actually build shared spaces, something that the International Fund for Ireland did. Legitimate. As I already said, funding is sort of a political football, but the aim of the International Fund is to mirror what the International Fund for Ireland did. The reason that the US was essential is because it was trusted by Catholics. And the reason that the Commonwealth was essential in the funders is it was trusted by Protestants. When we look at our conflict, the Israelis trust Congress. They do. And they also, to some extent, trust the Canadians. The Palestinians trust Europe and trust the Arab states. And the concept that we're trying to do is replicate the legitimacy and the newfound potential Gulf-Israeli alignment on some things to create a funding vehicle that can advance these potential things that will actually have a benefit and show legitimacy on the ground that can also help overcome the other issues. So where are we up to on this? It's not just sort of a pipe dream. ALLMEP's been working on this for a while, and we've made some interesting progress. I think the first thing to say is we've tried, and I think successfully, to make sure that as the international community examines what it's doing on this conflict, peace and reconciliation is no longer an afterthought. If you look at the quartet document that was produced on July 3rd, the 10th and final recommendation of that document, after much lobbying, actually recognized the need for the parties to take seriously the need to encourage peace and reconciliation and anti-incitement work in each of their societies. We also found out in sort of the expose of the Kerry talks that there was a culture of peace text that the parties actually spoke about in these negotiations. In addition to sort of the diplomatic work, we've been working legislatively, both here in Capitol Hill, in the UK Parliament, in Canada and elsewhere, getting legislators to put forward legislation to actually create an international fund. Given the uniqueness of the US congressional system on appropriations, we spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill. And actually 2 weeks ago, Congressman Jeff Fortenberry, a Republican appropriator, and Congressman Joe Crowley introduced a bill to authorize and create an international fund for Israeli-Palestinian peace. They were mirrored by representatives in London from the Conservative and Labour Party, actually introduced a private members bill, and we've been working with a few other governments, with the French initiative and others, to advance this agenda. Just to finish my remarks, something that Senator Mitchell said and has become a mantra of mine since I started this job. We don't believe that we are sufficient to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But too many people see us as nice, or as afterthought, or as sort of the cutesy stuff. But if the commanders for Israel's security sort it out, that will help. If we just look at economic development, that will be our solution. If we can just put the leaders in a room long enough, that's going to work. We are a necessary part of this problem. We're not sufficient, but if we are only seen as nice and not necessary, we will again repeat the same mistakes. And as a new administration attempts to make the ultimate deal, we have to remember, we have to create the foundations correct if we're going to create the long-term attitudinal change that Professor Humber shown that it's going up 2% each year, instead of at the moment that we have in our conflict, the most skeptical people in our conflict today are the youth, who make up the majority of the populations. And so if we need to reverse that trend, we need to do long-term strategic funding. Thanks very much.